Moon Jae-in's proposal to revise the 30-year-old constitution aimed at expanding people's basic rights and strengthening the country's democracy. It also included changes to the president's term and ways to strengthen local governments by decentralizing power. And before I sit down with an expert to talk more about this, let's first get a check on what's making the news at this hour with our Devin Whiting at the News Center. Devin.
Hi, Jiyoon. President Moon is on a 3-day state visit to Vietnam, the first leg of his 7-day two-nation tour. On this Friday, the South Korean leader held a bilateral summit with his Vietnamese counterpart to boost their country's 25-year-long relationship to a new level. Our chief Blue House correspondent Moon Kan-young is traveling with the president. She joins us live from Hanoi. So, Kan-young, what can you tell us about the president's state visit to Vietnam thus far?
Well, Devin, from a wreath-laying ceremony at the mausoleum of Vietnam's late president and revolutionary communist leader Ho Chi Minh to an official welcome ceremony at Vietnam's presidential palace, South Korean President Moon Jae-in took all the steps appropriate for a state visit, rounding up the last 25 years of diplomatic ties and setting out for a new 25 years of shared future. Well, following a bilateral summit between Presidents Moon and Chun Tae-kwang, the two adopted a joint declaration for a future-oriented relationship. The two presidents agreed to make joint efforts to achieve $100 billion in trade by 2020. Now, that's 2 years away, while further boosting a mutually beneficial cooperation in the manufacturing sector, especially such as the automobile industry. The two economies have, in recent years, become irreplaceable partners. Vietnam is currently South Korea's biggest trading partner among ASEAN nations, and South Korea is Vietnam's largest investor nation. Devin.
So what's on the South Korean leader's agenda for the rest of the day?
Well, I can tell you he still has quite a long day ahead of him. By the end of this afternoon, the South Korean leader will have met with top Vietnamese officials, including the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, the Prime Minister, as well as the chairwoman of Vietnam's National Assembly. Now, these guys are important because of the power structure of Vietnam. But President Moon will spend most of his late afternoon meeting businessmen from both South Korea and Vietnam, encouraging more active business and trade relations between the two countries. Another quite interesting agenda on the South Korean president's itinerary, he's expected to play career counselor to South Koreans seeking jobs in Vietnam. That, the presidential office says, is to encourage more young South Korean job seekers to tap into Vietnamese employment market. Devin.
All right, thank you for that, Kan-young. Our Moon Kan-young in Vietnam with the South Korean president. Now, South Korea's steel exporters can breathe a sigh of relief for a few more weeks at least. The United States has given them a temporary exemption to tariffs on steel and aluminum, along with exports from several other countries. While that exemption is in effect, South Korea and the U.S. will continue negotiations on potential changes to their FTA. Lee Seung-jae has this report.
Hours before the steel and aluminum tariffs were to go into effect, U.S. President Donald Trump put a pause on a number of countries and regions, including the EU. But more importantly, the list includes South Korea, the number 3 steel exporter to the U.S. According to the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer on Thursday, the idea that President Trump has is that based on a certain set of criteria, some nations should be left off. The temporary exemption is aimed at finding a more permanent solution to Washington's concerns of steel and aluminum dumping. Under the measures, the U.S. will impose tariffs of 25% on steel imports and 10% on aluminum imports for countries not listed in the temporary exemption. According to South Korean Trade Minister Kim Hyun-jong, the temporary exemption will last until the end of April for now, as the nation will continue to negotiate on the conditions for a permanent exemption. The announcement comes as Seoul and Washington continue talks to renegotiate their free trade agreement, with South Korean officials, including Kim, lobbying in Washington in recent days to earn the tariff exemption. South Korea's Foreign Minister Kang Kyunghee recently said a trade row at a time when both allies are trying to make progress in efforts to denuclearize the North would not be helpful, citing the importance of maintaining a united front on the North Korean nuclear weapons issue. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, President Trump has signed a memorandum paving the way for sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods. The move has angered Beijing, raising the prospect of a trade war between the world's two economic superpowers. Arirang reports.
President Trump has accused China of what he called years of intellectual property theft and Chinese pressure on American companies to hand knowledge over. He also reiterated his concerns over the growing trade deficit between the two countries.
But we have a trade deficit, depending on the way you calculate, of $504 billion. Now, some people would say it's really $375 billion. Many different ways of looking at it, but any way you look at it, it is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. It's out of control.
He went on to say that the punitive tariffs would benefit the U.S., adding that every trade deal had to be reciprocal.
And frankly, it's going to make us a much stronger, much richer nation. The word is reciprocal. That's the word I want everyone to remember. If they charge us, we charge them the same thing. That's the way it's got to be. That's not the way it is. For many, many years, for many decades, it has not been that way.
However, there are parts of the memorandum that are not as threatening as they seem. The terms include a 60-day consultation period during which lobbyists and legislators will get a chance to slim down the number of target products, which currently stands at about 1,300. But Trump did say that Thursday's memorandum was the first of many, which further raises the prospect of a global trade war. In addition to the tariffs, the Trump administration also plans to restrict new Chinese investments in America and take action against China at the World Trade Organization for what it calls unfair trade practices. This has sparked China to issue a belligerent response. Chinese embassy in Washington vowed to, quote, fight to the end in any trade war with the United States. Beijing's Commerce Ministry also announced through a statement Friday that it plans to slap tariffs on $3 billion worth of American imports ranging from steel to pork. It added that Beijing also plans to take legal action against the U.S. under the World Trade Organization framework. However, it did say that Beijing is willing to resolve the trade dispute with Washington through dialogue. Arirang, Arirang News.
In other news, former South Korean President Lee Myung-bak has been detained on corruption charges after a Seoul court last night issued a warrant for his arrest. Lee was taken from his home in southern Seoul to a detention center in the east of the capital. Our Cha Sang-mi, who was outside the detention center, has more.
The former president arrived at the Seoul Eastern Detention Center in Songpa-gu District, southeastern Seoul, in the early hours of Friday morning, less than an hour after the Seoul Central District Court issued an arrest warrant against him. Before leaving his home, the former president posted a photograph of a handwritten statement on his Facebook page, saying, quote, "I don't blame others. Everything is my fault, and I feel remorse." Lee's legal team expressed regret over the decision and said that this is the start of a long fight, signaling their plan to challenge each of the allegations in court. As for the interrogation, the prosecutors this morning said there will be no questioning today, considering Lee's old age and the busy schedule of his first day of detention, which includes a medical examination, but said they will be visiting the detention center for questioning in the near future. Normally, suspects processed by the Seoul Central District Court are detained at the Seoul Detention Center in Kyunghee-do Province, but the court decided to hold Lee at the Seoul Eastern Detention Center, considering another former president, Park Geun-hye, is being held at the Seoul Detention Center. Lee is now in solitary confinement on the top floor of the detention center in a cell just 10 square meters big. That sounds small, but it's actually double the size of an average solitary cell and includes a TV set and separate shower facilities. It's been about a year since Lee's successor Park Geun-hye was arrested on March 31, 2017 on serious corruption charges, including bribery and abuse of power. Her trial is coming to a close and prosecutors are demanding she serve 30 years in jail. With Lee Myung-bak's arrest, he becomes the fourth living former Korean president to have been detained over allegations of past corruption. The 76-year-old faces at least 14 charges, the most serious of which is receiving $10 million in bribes from businesses and agencies. Other charges include embezzlement, tax evasion, and a violation of election law. This also marks the first time in 23 years that two ex-presidents are detained at the same time. Ex-presidents Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo were jailed for mutiny and corruption in 1995, but were released 2 years later through a presidential pardon. Cha Sang-mi, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
Korea's 30-year-old constitution is about to get a major facelift as President Moon Jae-in's proposal for constitutional revision is set to be submitted to the National Assembly on Monday. Now, the revision proposes a 4-year, 2-term presidency replacing the current 5-year single term. It also lowers the legal voting age to 18 from the current 19 and grants more autonomy to local governments. And before we go into further talking about the revision bill, let's first listen to what Cho Guk, Senior Presidential Secretary for Civil Affairs, said in a media conference outlining President Moon's proposals on Tuesday.
The upcoming constitutional amendments must be centered on the people. The amendments must expand basic rights to guarantee freedom, safety, and quality of life, and broaden the people's rights such as through the expansion of direct democracy.
And to talk to us more about this, Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyunghee University joins us in the studio today. Hello, Professor.
Good to be here.
All right, so before we get into the all details about this revision, let's first talk about why such a revision to our 30-year-old Constitution is necessary and how many revisions have been made to the Constitution up until now.
We have made 9 amendments so far. It's been 31 years since the last amendment, but the first Constitution was promulgated in 1948, so it's a 70th year, actually. Those amendments, if you look at the different aspects of it, the vast majority of it has to do with how to elect presidents and how long they serve. First, several ones, there's some shameful history of kind of shoring up dictatorial regimes, but especially since 1989, Korea had shown some knee-jerk reaction against having a longer term, sort of reminiscent of the dictatorial regime. So 5-year term has been the norm. But a couple of things kind of prompted this thing. I think that the unfortunate history of having 2 presidents at the same time in the jail, that shows that there is something wrong with the presidential power structure, first of all. And the term itself, 5 years, is kind of short, since we are kind of out of this trauma of having dictators at this point. Probably we need to have a more stable system where we can look to a long-term planning for the national affairs.
Now, before we go into this further, I think it was interesting that President Moon's revision bill was announced by the Blue House and outlined over a period of 3 days. Now, was there a certain reason behind this scheduling?
Well, the opposition is criticizing that they're making a political show, became a mini-series of it. Certainly, they could have done it in one spot and announced it all at the same time. But I understand that there are a lot of different revisions. And as you know, the news cycles kind of focus on top 2, at most 3 items. So having 3 different chunks divided by different aspects of the amendment, I think it's a nice idea.
All right. So in the first chunk, the presidential office spoke about the preamble of the new constitution as well as the revisions to enhance basic rights and sovereignty of the people. Tell us more about this.
The Constitution has a distinctive characteristic that it promotes more of a human rights aspect of it, individual rights aspect of it. I think it has 2 kind of causes for it. One is the Korea has developed thus far. And we concentrate on the economic aspect of it at first, and then there's a political kind of reforms. Now, Korea is turning its attention more to the social issues and more of individual rights issues. So I think it's kind of natural in that development. But the other side is President Moon has a background of human rights attorney. So I think that aspect of it is very dear to his heart, and that's reflected in this proposal.
And now this bill also seeks to reinforce the rights of laborers, stipulating that workers and employers will have equal rights when it comes to the decision-making process. Tell us more about these changes.
I think a lot of people think that it's just a semantics, but if you kind of be sensitive about it, the 근로자, as it is written in the current constitution, strict, definitional meaning is a worker who diligently works. And it does have a kind of a user's point of view, employer's point of view, because employee, it does not have a meaning if there's no employer. I think this new language, kind of stressing the worker aspect of it is, no matter how the employment situation is, if you're a worker, then his rights has to be protected and enhanced. I think that not only the definitional semantics of it, I think that this constitution is kind of mandating or promoting that their rights has to be expanded, and certainly there are some provisions that indicate that direction.
Now, before we go on, let's listen to what came out of the second part of the government's presentation on the revision bill, which focused on elements of the Constitution concerning the economy and the decentralization of government.
We must resolve the imbalance between Seoul and its surrounding regions and the rest of the country. The growth of the nation must lead to growth for the people. And to resolve the issue of increasing social inequality, the concept of land as a public resource that allows special restrictions or obligations to be imposed when necessary for efficient use and to protect the public nature of land will be stipulated. People's right to manage and recall their elected representatives and officials must also be enhanced.
So what are some of the parts in the revision that talk about, again, strengthening the sovereignty of the people in detail, I guess?
Right. I think what stands out is the inclusion of a recall of the National Assemblyman and also the ballot initiative, which are not really new. A lot of, for example, American states have this system that opens up more avenue for the people to participate in the political process. I think in that sense there is a shown tendency that this constitution gives more power to the people. I think what it does is that, if you put it simply, a lot of, not all, but a lot of National Assemblymen will bow very deeply during the election campaign, but then after that they will just forget about their constituents and then come back after the next election cycle. Well, now they have to be very mindful of the optics of what they do and what kind of impact it has to the constituents. And they have to be very concerned about the rumors and reputations, because it can kind of result in the recall or having a bad reputation that will affect their electability. So I think it kind of brings the constituents and the elected officials closer together.
All right. And as we just heard from Mr. Cho-guk, tell us more about the changes we can expect in regards to the concept of land as a public resource.
Well, the real estate obviously is a private property, but as you can see in the kind of zoning laws and all those, the real estate and the buildings on it has a public nature to it. For example, tall buildings will affect the adjacent buildings in the sunlight accessibility and the skyline, the aesthetics of it, the beauty of it, will affect everybody. So this concept has always been there, but this constitution kind of strengthened that idea for a very specific purpose, actually. The speculative investment in the real estate has been the problem all along. So this constitution makes it possible for the president and the government to regulate more of the use and the investment aspect of the real estate. I think it has a singular purpose to it.
And the presidential office also says the revision will provide a legal basis for the transfer of the capital. Tell us more about this.
Right. It's a little bit peculiar. During the time of Roh Moo-hyun administration, there was an effort to relocate the capital at the time. The Constitutional Court at the time rendered a decision which a lot of people thought was peculiar. They said the Seoul is the capital city because of the Constitution. Not an express language, because there is none, but because the customary Constitution. So ever since then, the changing the capital has become a constitutional matter, and without the revisions, you cannot relocate the capital.
All right. Now, last but not least, let's take a listen to what President Moon had in mind in regards to reforming the country's current electoral system, as well as redistributing power.
The administrative reforms start by reforming the electoral system. Therefore, under the constitutional amendment, 18-year-olds will be eligible to vote. The president's power will be curtailed, while the prime minister and the National Assembly will be given more power. Reform of the power structure should respect public sentiment. Policy sustainability will be ensured by giving presidents the opportunity to seek re-election by implementing a 4-year, 2-term presidency.
So the president's power will be curtailed, like we just heard, and there are also a number of changes in regards to giving more autonomy to local governments. Now, why are such changes necessary to the president's power, as well as giving more autonomy to local governments?
Well, this is the meat of this constitutional amendment. A lot of problems has been kind of pointed to the fact that the president is too strong. They call it imperial presidency. Whether it is exactly, you can make the cause singularly on that point or not, that has been on the agenda every time we have talked about the amendments. So in that sense, they made several changes. One is some of it are optics. They deleted the phrase that says he's a head of state, which doesn't, in effect, it does not change much, but they want to make the languages to the point that the president is not the imperial president, and the president does not have all the powers. You have to look at it from the other side of the amendment, which is, as you said, the strengthening of the local governments, which will have the impact of changing the landscape of our political system, where instead of just looking at the central government to do everything, the local government, although it has been kind of going to that direction, probably this is pushing further, that the Korean life should be a local life more than anything, and all the politics and the concerns that people have should be the local matters rather than the singularly central government matters.
And going along with that, the proposal pushes for a 2-term, 4-year term for presidency instead of the current 5-year single term. I know you talked about this earlier, but tell us more about why this was necessary.
Right. It's a U.S. system. I think that the 8-year term, now the incumbent always have a very big advantage over the new challengers. So it's not a stretch of terms to say that this is a really 8-year term proposal. Unless extraordinary affairs happens, you will get reelected. I think that's the expectation. That allows a longer term, the planning, and it allows for kind of putting into a system where the long-term perspective can work. I think that the frequent criticism about the current presidency system is you become a president, and a couple of years you get used to it, and then you become a lame duck about a year after. So that eliminates that kind of prospect. But I think the downside is also probably anticipatory, because in the U.S. you see that after a couple of years of presidency, you start campaigning for the second term. And as you know, that Donald Trump has already campaigning even before the 1 year is out. So a lot of people say that that's a waste, but I think there's a give and take. I think at this point, a lot of people have a consensus that at this juncture in the Korean politics, we need a longer term plans.
So there's been a lot of opposition from political parties in regards to this revision, but I mean, what awaits this revision bill once President Moon submits it to the National Assembly on Monday?
Well, I think the opposition, probably. And this is an interesting part of political drama. The opposition is saying the prime minister should be strengthened, and it has to be to the point where it's like a parliamentary system. Now, the same proposal, the presidency-based system was proposed by the now opposition party several years ago. At that time, the main ruling party at the time, as an opposition party, made the same argument that the opposition party is making now. So a lot of people think that, well, it's a political calculation, or if you think that your party is not going to be in the main party next time, it's better have the power in the National Assembly, and hence the Prime Minister. I think that the discussion is worthwhile, regardless of the political intentions. Korea is long due to talk about what is the merits and demerits of the presidential system, or having a very decentralized system where a prime minister has the power to take care of the national matters. So I think that the debates will go on.
But do you think it'll get passed by the National Assembly?
A lot of people are pessimistic, and I kind of join it because of the matter. But if you look at the prospect of it, if you're an opposition party, if you successfully block it, then you're stuck with the presidential system in the next cycle as well, and which is not an attractive option. So I wouldn't rule out a possibility that they will come together and say at least work on the presidential election part.
All right, we'll look forward to where this goes from here on out. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
And that wraps it up for today and this week, but we'll be back next week with more of the day's top stories and an in-depth look at ongoing issues here in Korea and around the world. So don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.